Chapters 5 and 6 of Book 5 of Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 5, the end of which does not resemble the beginning. Chapter 5. Cosette after the letter. As Cosette read, she gradually fell into thought. At the very moment when she raised her eyes from the last line of the notebook, the handsome officer passed triumphantly in front of the gate. It was his hour. Cosette thought him hideous. She resumed her contemplation of the book. It was written in the most charming of chirography, thought Cosette, in the same hand, but with divers inks, sometimes very black, again whitish, as when ink has been added to the inkstand, and consequently on different days. It was, then, a mind which had unfolded itself there, sigh by sigh, irregularly, without order, without choice, without object, haphazard. Cosette had never read anything like it. This manuscript, in which she already perceived more light than obscurity, produced upon her the effect of a half-opened sanctuary. Each one of these mysterious lines shone before her eyes and inundated her heart with a strange radiance. The education which she had received had always talked to her of the soul, and never of love, very much as one might talk of the firebrand and not the flame. This manuscript of 15 pages suddenly and sweetly revealed to her all of love, sorrow, destiny, life, eternity, the beginning, the end. It was as if a hand had opened and suddenly flung upon her a handful of rays of light. In these few lines she felt a passionate, ardent, generous, honest nature, a sacred will, an immense sorrow, and an immense despair, a suffering heart, an ecstasy fully expanded. What was this manuscript? A letter. A letter without name, without address, without date, without signature, pressing and disinterested, an enigma composed of truths, a message of love made to be brought by an angel and read by a virgin, an appointment made beyond the bounds of earth, the love letter of a phantom to a shade. It was an absent one, tranquil and dejected, who seemed ready to take refuge in death, and who sent to the absent love, his lady, the secret of fate, the key of life, love. This had been written with one foot in the grave and one finger in heaven. These lines, which had fallen one by one on the paper, were what might be called drops of soul. Now, from whom could these pages come? Who could have penned them? Cosette did not hesitate for a moment. One man only. He! Day had dawned once more in her spirit. All had reappeared. She felt an unheard-of joy and a profound anguish. It was he who had written. He was there. It was he whose arm had been thrust through that railing. While she was forgetful of him, he had found her again. But had she forgotten him? No, never. She was foolish to have thought so for a single moment. She had always loved him, always adored him. The fire had been smothered and had smothered for a time, but she saw all plainly now. It had but made headway, and now it had burst forth afresh, and had inflamed her whole being. This notebook was like a spark which had fallen from that other soul into hers. She felt the conflagration starting up once more. She imbued herself thoroughly with every word of the manuscript. "Oh, yes," said she. "How perfectly I recognize all that." That is what I had already read in his eyes. As she was finishing it for the third time, Lieutenant Théodule passed the gate once more, and rattled his spurs upon the pavement. Cosette was forced to raise her eyes. She thought him insipid, silly, stupid, useless, foppish, displeasing, impertinent, and extremely ugly. The officer thought it his duty to smile at her. She turned away as in shame and indignation. She would gladly have thrown something at his head. She fled, re-entered the house, and shut herself up in her chamber to peruse the manuscript once more, to learn it by heart and to dream. When she had thoroughly mastered it, she kissed it and put it in her bosom. All was over. Cosette had fallen back into deep, seraphic love. The abyss of Eden had yawned once more. All day long Cosette remained in a sort of bewilderment. She scarcely thought. Her ideas were in the state of a tangled skein in her brain. She could not manage to conjecture anything. She hoped through a tremor. What? Vague things. She dared make herself no promises, and she did not wish to refuse herself anything. Flashes of pallor passed over her countenance, and shivers ran through her frame. It seemed to her, at intervals, that she was entering the land of chimeras. She said to herself, "Is this reality?" Then she felt of the dear paper within her bosom under her gown. She pressed it to her heart. She felt its angles against her flesh, and if Jean Valjean had seen her at the moment, he would have shuddered in the presence of that luminous and unknown joy, which overflowed from beneath her eyelids. "Oh yes," she thought, "it is certainly he. This comes from him and is for me." And she told herself that an intervention of angels, a celestial dance, had given him back to her. O transfiguration of love, O dreams! That celestial dance, that intervention of the angels, was a pellet of bread tossed by one thief to another thief, from the Charlemagne courtyard to the Lion's Ditch, over the roofs of La Force. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. Old people are made to go out opportunely. When evening came, Jean Valjean went out. Cosette dressed herself. She arranged her hair in the most becoming manner, and she put on a dress whose bodice had received one snip of the scissors too much, and which, through this slope, permitted a view of the beginning of her throat, and was, as young girls say, a trifle indecent. It was not in the least indecent, but it was prettier than usual. She made her toilet thus without knowing why she did so. Did she mean to go out? No. Was she expecting a visitor? No. At dusk she went down to the garden. Toussaint was busy in her kitchen, which opened to the backyard. She began to stroll under the trees, thrusting aside the branches from time to time with her hand, because there were some which hung very low. In this manner she reached the bench. The stone was still there. She sat down and gently laid her white hand on this stone as though she wished to caress and thank it. All at once she experienced that indefinable impression which one undergoes when there is someone standing behind one, even when she does not see the person. She turned her head and rose to her feet. It was he. His head was bare. He appeared to have grown thin and pale. His black clothes were hardly discernible. The twilight threw a wan light on his fine brow and covered his eyes in shadows. Beneath a veil of incomparable sweetness, he had something about him that suggested death and night. His face was illuminated by the light of the dying day, and by the thought of a soul that is taking flight. He seemed to be not yet a ghost, and he was no longer a man. He had flung away his hat in the thicket, a few paces distant. Cosette, though ready to swoon, uttered no cry. She retreated slowly, for she felt herself attracted. He did not stir. By virtue of something ineffable and melancholy which enveloped him, she felt the look in his eyes which she could not see. Cosette, in her retreat, encountered a tree and leaned against it. Had it not been for this tree, she would have fallen. Then she heard his voice, that voice which she had really never heard, barely rising above the rustle of the leaves, and murmuring, "Pardon me, here I am. My heart is full. I could not live on as I was living, and I have come. Have you read what I placed there on the bench? Do you recognize me at all? Have no fear of me. It is a long time, you remember the day, since you looked at me at the Luxembourg, near the Gladiator. And the day when you passed before me, it was on the 16th of June and the 2nd of July. It is nearly a year ago. I have not seen you for a long time. I inquired at the woman who let the chairs, and she told me that she no longer saw you. You lived in the Rue de l'Ouest, on the 3rd floor, in the front apartments of a new house. You see that I know. I followed you. What else was there for me to do? And then you disappeared. I thought I saw you pass once, while I was reading the newspapers under the arcade of the Odéon. I ran after you, but no, it was a person who had a bonnet like yours. At night I came hither. Do not be afraid, no one sees me. I come to gaze upon your windows near at hand. I walk very softly, so that you may not hear, for you might be alarmed. The other evening I was behind you, you turned round, I fled. Once I heard you singing. I was happy. Did it affect you because I heard you singing through the shutters? That could not hurt you. No, it is not so? You see, you are my angel. Let me come sometimes. I think that I am going to die. If you only knew! I adore you. Forgive me, I speak to you, but I do not know what I am saying. I may have displeased you. Have I displeased you? Oh, my mother, she said. And she sank down as though on the point of death. He grasped her. She fell. He took her in his arms. He pressed her close, without knowing what he was doing. He supported her as though he was tottering himself. It was as though his brain were full of smoke. Lightning started between his lips. His ideas vanished. It seemed to him that he was accomplishing some religious act, and that he was committing a profanation. Moreover, he had not the least passion for this lovely woman whose force he felt against his breast. He was beside himself with love. She took his hand and laid it on her heart. He felt the paper there. He stammered, "You love me, then?" She replied in a voice so low that it was no longer anything more than a barely audible breath. "Hush! Thou knowest it." And she hid her blushing face on the breast of the superb and intoxicated young man. He fell upon the bench, and she beside him. They had no words more. The stars were beginning to gleam. How did it come to pass that their lips met? How comes it to pass that the birds sing, that snow melts, that the rose unfolds, that May expands, that the dawn grows white beyond the black trees of the shivering crest of the hills? A kiss, and that was all. Both started and gazed into the darkness with sparkling eyes. They felt neither the cool night, nor the cold stone, nor the damp earth, nor the wet grass. They had looked at each other, and their hearts were full of thoughts. They had clasped hands unconsciously. She did not ask him, she did not even wonder, how he had entered there, and how he had made his way into the garden. It seemed so simple to her that he should be there. From time to time, Marius's knee touched Cosette's knee, and both shivered. At intervals, Cosette stammered a word. Her soul fluttered on her lips like a drop of dew on a flower. Little by little they began to talk to each other. Effusion followed silence, which is fullness. The night was serene and splendid overhead. These two beings, pure as spirits, told each other everything. Their dreams, their intoxications, their ecstasies, their chimeras, their weaknesses, how they had adored each other from afar, how they had longed for each other, their despair when they had ceased to see each other. They confided to each other in an ideal intimacy, which nothing could augment, their most secret and most mysterious thoughts. They related to each other, with candid faith in their illusions, all that love, youth, and the remains of childhood which still lingered about them, suggested to their minds. Their two hearts poured themselves out into each other in such wise that at the expiration of a quarter of an hour, it was the young man who had the young girl's soul, and the young girl who had the young man's soul. Each became permeated with the other. They were enchanted with each other. They dazzled each other. When they had finished, when they had told each other everything, she laid her head on his shoulder and asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Marius," said he. "And yours?" "My name is Cosette." End of Book 5, Chapter 6.
Chapter 1 of Book 6 of Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 6, Little Gavroche. Chapter 1, The Malicious Playfulness of the Wind. Since 1823, when the tavern of Montfermeil was on its way to shipwreck, and was being gradually engulfed, not in the abyss of bankruptcy, but in the cesspool of petty debts, the Thénardier pair had had 2 other children, both males. That made 5, 2 girls and 3 boys. Madame Thénardier had got rid of the last 2, while they were still young and very small, with remarkable luck. Got rid of is the word. There was but a mere fragment of nature in that woman, a phenomenon, by the way, of which there is more than one example extant. Like the Maréchale de la Mothe-Houdancourt, the Thénardier was a mother to her daughters only. There her maternity ended. Her hatred of the human race began with her own sons. In the direction of her sons, her evil disposition was uncompromising, and her heart had a lugubrious wall in that quarter. As the reader has seen, she detested the eldest, she cursed the other two. Why? Because. The most terrible of motives, the most unanswerable of retorts, because. I have no need of a litter of squalling brats, said this mother. Let us explain how the Thénardiers had succeeded in getting rid of their last two children, and even in drawing profit from the operation. The woman Magnon, who was mentioned a few pages further back, was the same one who had succeeded in making old Gillenormand support the two children which she had had. She lived on the Quai des Célestins, at the corner of this ancient street of the Petit Musc, which afforded her the opportunity of changing her evil repute into good odour. The reader will remember the great epidemic of croup which ravaged the river districts of the Seine in Paris 35 years ago, and of which science took advantage to make experiments on a grand scale as to the efficacy of inhalations of alum, so beneficially replaced at the present day by the external tincture of iodine. During this epidemic, the Magnon lost both her boys, who were still very young, one in the morning, the other in the evening of the same day. This was a blow. These children were precious to their mother. They represented 80 francs a month. These 80 francs were punctually paid in the name of Monsieur Gillenormand, by collector of his rents, Monsieur Barge, a retired tipstaff in the Rue des Rois de Sicile. The children dead, the income was at an end. The Magnon sought an expedient. In that dark Freemasonry of evil, of which she formed a part, everything is known, all secrets are kept, and all lend mutual aid. Magnon needed 2 children. The Thénardiers had 2. The same sex, the same age. A good arrangement for the one, a good investment for the other. The little Thénardiers became little Magnons. Magnon quitted the Quai de la Célestine and went to live in the Rue Clocheperce. In Paris, the identity which binds an individual to himself is broken between one street and another. The registry office being in no way warned, raised no objections, and the substitution was effected in the most simple manner in the world. Only, the Thénardier extracted for this loan of her children 10 francs a month, which Magnon promised to pay, and which she actually did pay. It is unnecessary to add that Monsieur Gillenormand continued to perform his compact. He came to see the children every 6 months. He did not perceive the change. "Monsieur," Magnon said to him, "how much they resemble you!" Thénardier, to whom avatars were easy, seized this occasion to become Jondrette. His 2 daughters and Gavroche had hardly had time to discover that they had 2 little brothers. When a certain degree of misery is reached, one is overpowered with a sort of spectral indifference, and one regards human beings as though they were spectres. Your nearest relations are often no more for you than vague shadowy forms, barely outlined against a nebulous background of life, and easily confounded again with the invisible. On the evening of the day when she handed over her 2 little ones to Magnon, with express intention of renouncing them forever, the Thénardier had felt, or had appeared to feel, a scruple. She said to her husband, "But this is abandoning our children." Thénardier, masterful and phlegmatic, cauterized the scruple with this saying, "Jean-Jacques Rousseau did even better." From scruples, the mother proceeded to uneasiness. "But what if the police were to annoy us? Tell me, Monsieur Thénardier, is what we have done permissible?" Thénardier replied, "Everything is permissible. No one will see anything but true blue in it. Besides, no one has any interest in looking closely after children who have not a sou." Magnon was a sort of fashionable woman in the sphere of crime. She was careful about her toilet. She shared her lodgings, which were furnished in an affected and wretched style, with a clever Gallicized English thief. This Englishwoman, who had become a naturalized Parisienne, recommended by very wealthy relations, intimately connected with the medals in the library and Mademoiselle Mar's diamonds, became celebrated later on in judicial accounts. She was called Mamselle Miss. The two little creatures who had fallen to Magnon had no reason to complain of their lot. Recommended by the 80 francs, they were well cared for, as is everything from which profit is derived. They were neither badly clothed nor badly fed. They were treated almost like little gentlemen, better by their false mother than by their real one. Magnon played the lady and talked no thieves' slang in their presence. Thus passed several years. Thénardier augured well from the fact. One day he chanced to say to Magnon as she handed him his monthly stipend of 10 francs, "The father must give them some education." All at once, these two poor children, who had, up to that time, been protected tolerably well, even by their evil fate, were abruptly hurled into life and forced to begin it for themselves. A wholesale arrest of malefactors, like that in the Jondrette garret, necessarily complicated by investigations and subsequent incarcerations, is a veritable disaster for that hideous and occult counter-society which pursues its existence beneath public society. An adventure of this description entails all sorts of catastrophes in that sombre world. The Thénardier catastrophe involved the catastrophe of Magnon. One day, a short time after Magnon had handed to Éponine the note relating to the Rue Plumet, a sudden raid was made by the police in the Rue Clocheperce. Magnon was seized, as was also Mamselle Miss, and all the inhabitants of the house, which was of a suspicious character, were gathered into the net. While this was going on, the two little boys were playing in the backyard and saw nothing of the raid. When they tried to enter the house again, they found the door fastened and the house empty. A cobbler opposite called them to him, and delivered to them a paper which their mother had left for them. On this paper there was an address, Monsieur Barge, collector of rents, Rue de la Roi de Sicile, number 8. The proprietor of the stall said to them, "You cannot live here any longer. Go there. It is near by, the first street on the left. Ask your way from this paper." The children set out, the elder leading the younger, and holding in his hand the paper which was to guide them. It was cold, and his benumbed little fingers could not close very firmly, and they did not keep a very good hold on the paper. At the corner of the Rue Clocheperce, a gust of wind tore it from him, and as night was falling, the child was not able to find it again. They began to wander aimlessly through the streets. End of Book 6, Chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of Book 6 of Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 6, Little Gavroche. Chapter 2, in which Little Gavroche extracts profit from Napoleon the Great. Spring in Paris is often traversed by harsh and piercing breezes, which do not precisely chill, but freeze one. These north winds, which sadden the most beautiful days, produce exactly the effect of those puffs of cold air which enter a warm room through the cracks of a badly fitting door or window. It seems as though the gloomy door of winter had remained ajar, and as though the wind were pouring through it. In the spring of 1832, the epoch when the first great epidemic of this century broke out in Europe, these north gales were more harsh and piercing than ever. It was a door even more glacial than that of winter which was ajar. It was the door of the sepulchre. In these winds one felt the breath of the cholera. From a meteorological point of view, these cold winds possessed this peculiarity, that they did not preclude a strong electric tension. Frequent storms, accompanied by thunder and lightning, burst forth at this epoch. One evening, when these gales were blowing rudely, to such a degree that January seemed to have returned, and that the bourgeois had resumed their cloaks, little Gavroche, who was always shivering gaily under his rags, was standing as though in ecstasy before a wig-maker's shop in the vicinity of the Orme Saint-Gervais. He was adorned with a woman's woollen shawl, picked up no one knows where, and which he had converted into a neck comforter. Little Gavroche appeared to be engaged in intent admiration of a wax bride in a low-necked dress, and crowned with orange flowers, who was revolving in the window and displaying her smile to passers-by, between two argand lamps. But in reality he was taking an observation of the shop, in order to discover whether he could not prig from the shop front a cake of soap, which he would then proceed to sell for a sou to a hairdresser in the suburbs. He had often managed to breakfast off of such a roll. He called his species of work, for which he possessed special aptitude, shaving barbers. While contemplating the bride and eyeing the cake of soap, he muttered between his teeth, "Tuesday. It was not Tuesday. Was it Tuesday? Perhaps it was Tuesday. Yes, it was Tuesday." No one has ever discovered to what this monologue referred. Yes, perchance, this monologue had some connection with the last occasion on which he had dined, 3 days before, for it was now Friday. The barber in his shop, which was warmed by a good stove, was shaving a customer and casting a glance from time to time at the enemy, that freezing and impudent street urchin, both of whose hands were in his pockets, but whose mind was evidently unsheathed. While Gavroche was scrutinizing the shop window and the cakes of Windsor soap, 2 children of unequal stature, very neatly dressed and still smaller than himself, one apparently 7 years of age, the other 5, timidly turned the handle and entered the shop, with a request for something or other, alms possibly, in a plaintive murmur which resembled a groan rather than a prayer. They both spoke at once, and their words were unintelligible because sobs broke the voice of the younger, and the teeth of the elder were chattering with cold. The barber wheeled round with a furious look, and without abandoning his razor, thrust back the elder with his left hand, and the younger with his knee, and slammed his door, saying, "The idea of coming in and freezing everybody for nothing!" The 2 children resumed their march in tears. In the meantime, a cloud had risen. It had begun to rain. Little Gavroche ran after them and accosted them. "What's the matter with you, brats?" "We don't know where we are to sleep," replied the elder. "Is that all?" said Gavroche. "A great matter, truly. The idea of bawling about that! They must be greenies." And adopting, in addition to his superiority, which was rather bantering, an accent of tender authority and gentle patronage, "Come along with me, young uns." "Yes, sir," said the elder. And the 2 children followed him as they would have followed an archbishop. They had stopped crying. Gavroche led them up the Rue Saint-Antoine, in the direction of the Bastille. As Gavroche walked along, he cast an indignant backward glance at the barber's shop. "That fellow has no heart, the whiting," he muttered. "He's an Englishman." A woman who caught sight of these 3 marching in a file, with Gavroche at their head, burst into noisy laughter. This laugh was wanting in respect towards the group. "Good day, Mademoiselle Omnibus," said Gavroche to her. An instant later, the wig-maker occurred to his mind once more, and he added, "I am making a mistake in the beast. He's not a whiting, he's a serpent. Barber, I'll go and fetch a locksmith, and I'll have a bell hung to your tail." This wig-maker had rendered him aggressive. As he strode over a gutter, he apostrophized a bearded portress who was worthy to meet Faust on the Brocken, and who had a broom in her hand. "Madam," said he, "so you are going out with your horse?" And thereupon he spattered the polished boots of a pedestrian. "You scamp!" shouted the furious pedestrian. Gavroche elevated his nose above his shawl. "Is monsieur complaining?" "Of you!" ejaculated the man. "The office is closed," said Gavroche. "I do not receive any more complaints." In the meanwhile, as he went on up the street, he perceived a beggar girl, 13 or 14 years old, and clad in so short a gown that her knees were visible, lying thoroughly chilled under a porte cochere. The little girl was getting to be too old for such a thing. Growth does play these tricks. The petticoat becomes short at the moment when nudity becomes indecent. "Poor girl," said Gavroche, "she hasn't even trousers. Hold on, take this." And unwinding all the comfortable woollen which he had around his neck, he flung it on the thin and purple shoulders of the beggar girl, where the scarf became a shawl once more. The child stared at him in astonishment, and received the shawl in silence. When a certain stage of distress has been reached in his misery, the poor man no longer groans over evil, no longer returns thanks for good. That done, "Brrr," said Gavroche, who was shivering more than Saint Martin, for the latter retained one half of his cloak. At this "brrr," the downpour of rain, redoubled in its spite, became furious. The wicked skies punish good deeds. "Ah, come now!" exclaimed Gavroche. "What's the meaning of this? It's re-raining. Good heavens! If it goes on like this, I shall stop my subscription." And he set out on the march once more. "It's all right," he resumed, casting a glance at the beggar girl, as she coiled up under the shawl. "She's got a famous peel." And looking up at the clouds, he exclaimed, "Caught!" The two children followed close on his heels. As they were passing one of these heavy grated lattices, which indicate a baker's shop, for bread is put behind bars like gold, Gavroche turned round. "Ah, by the way, brats, have we dined?" "Monsieur," replied the elder, "we have had nothing to eat since this morning." "So you have neither father nor mother?" resumed Gavroche majestically. "Excuse us, sir, we have a papa and a mamma, but we don't know where they are." "Sometimes that's better than knowing where they are," said Gavroche, who was a thinker. "We have been wandering about these 2 hours," continued the elder. "We have hunted for things at the corners of the street, but we have found nothing." "I know," ejaculated Gavroche. "It's the dogs who eat everything." He went on after a pause. "Ah, we have lost our authors. We don't know what we have done with them. This should not be, gamins. It's stupid to let old people stray off like that. Come now, we must have a snooze all the same." However, he asked them no questions. What was more simple than that they should have no dwelling place? The elder of the two children, who had almost entirely recovered the prompt heedlessness of childhood, uttered this exclamation: "It's queer all the same. Mamma told us that she would take us to get a blessed spray on Palm Sunday." "Bosh!" said Gavroche. "Mamma," resumed the elder, "is a lady who lives with Mademoiselle Miss." "Tan flute!" retorted Gavroche. Meanwhile, he had halted, and for the last 2 minutes he had been feeling and fumbling in all sorts of nooks which his rags contained. At last he tossed his head with an air intended to be merely satisfied, but which was triumphant in reality. "Let us be calm, young uns. Here's supper for 3." And from one of his pockets he drew forth a sou. Without allowing the 2 urchins time for amazement, he pushed both of them before him into the baker's shop, and flung his sou on the counter, crying, "Boy, 5 centimes worth of bread." The baker, who was the proprietor in person, took up a loaf and a knife. "In 3 pieces, my boy," went on Gavroche, and he added with dignity, "There are 3 of us." And seeing that the baker, after scrutinizing the 3 customers, had taken down a black loaf, he thrust his finger far up his nose with an inhalation as imperious as though he had had a pinch of the great Frederick's snuff on the tip of his thumb, and hurled this indignant apostrophe full in the baker's face: Qu'est-ce que ça? Those of our readers who might be tempted to espy in this interpolation of Gavroche's to the baker a Russian or Polish word, or one of those savage cries which the Yoways and the Botacudos hurl at each other from bank to bank of a river athwart the solitudes, are warned that it is a word which they, our readers, utter every day, and which takes the place of the phrase, Qu'est-ce que c'est que cela? The baker understood perfectly and replied, Well, it's bread, and very good bread of the second quality. You mean larton brutal, black bread? Retorted Gavroche, calmly and coldly disdainful. White bread, boy, white bread, larton savant. I'm standing treat. The baker could not repress a smile, and as he cut the white bread, he surveyed them in a compassionate way which shocked Gavroche. Come now, baker's boy, said he, what are you taking our measure like that for? All three of them placed end to end would have hardly made a measure. When the bread was cut, the baker threw the sou into his drawer, and Gavroche said to the two children, Grub away. The little boys stared at him in surprise. Gavroche began to laugh. Ah, hello, that's so. They don't understand yet, they're too small. And he repeated, Eat away. At the same time, he held out a piece of bread to each of them, and thinking that the elder, who seemed to him more worthy of his conversation, deserved some special encouragement and ought to be relieved from all hesitation to satisfy his appetite, he added, as he handed him the largest share, Ram that into your muzzle. One piece was smaller than the others. He kept this for himself. The poor children, including Gavroche, were famished. As they tore their bread apart in big mouthfuls, they blocked up the shop of the baker, who, now that they had paid their money, looked angrily at them. Let's go into the street again, said Gavroche. They set off once more in the direction of the Bastille. From time to time, as they passed the lighted shop windows, the smallest halted to look at the time on a leaden watch, which was suspended from his neck by a cord. Well, he is a very green 'un, said Gavroche. Then, becoming thoughtful, he muttered between his teeth, All the same, if I had charge of the babes, I'd lock 'em up better than that. Just as they were finishing their morsel of bread, and had reached the angle of that gloomy Rue de Ballet, at the other end of which the low and threatening wicket of La Force was visible. Hullo! Is that you, Gavroche? Said someone. Hullo! Is that you, Montparnasse? Said Gavroche. A man had just accosted the street urchin, and the man was no other than Montparnasse in disguise, with blue spectacles, but recognizable to Gavroche. The bow-wows, went on Gavroche. You've got a hide the colour of a linseed plaster, and blue specs like a doctor. You're putting on style, 'pon my word. Hush! ejaculated Montparnasse. Not so loud. And he drew Gavroche hastily out of range of the lighted shops. The two little ones followed mechanically, holding each other by the hand. When they were ensconced under the arch of a porte cochère, sheltered from the rain and from all eyes. Do you know where I'm going? demanded Montparnasse. To the Abbey of Ascend with Regret, replied Gavroche. Joker. And Montparnasse went on, I'm going to find Babet. Ah, exclaimed Gavroche, so her name is Babet. Montparnasse lowered his voice. Not she, he. Ah, Babet. Yes, Babet. I thought he was buckled. He has undone the buckle, replied Montparnasse, and he rapidly related to the gamin how, on the morning of that very day, Babet, having been transferred to La Conciergerie, had made his escape by turning to the left instead of the right in the police office. Gavroche expressed his admiration for this skill. What a dentist! He cried. Montparnasse added a few details as to Babet's flight, and ended with, Oh, that is not all. Gavroche, as he listened, had seized a cane that Montparnasse held in his hand, and mechanically pulled at the upper part, and the blade of a dagger made its appearance. "Ah!" he exclaimed, pushing the dagger back in haste, "you have brought along your gendarme disguised as a bourgeois." Montparnasse winked. "The deuce!" resumed Gavroche. "So you're going to have a bout with the bobbies?" "You can't tell," replied Montparnasse with an indifferent air. "It's always a good thing to have a pin about one." Gavroche persisted. "What are you up to tonight?" Again Montparnasse took a grave tone and said, mouthing every syllable, "Things." And abruptly changing the conversation, "By the way." "What?" "Something happened the other day. Fancy! I met a bourgeois. He makes me a present of a sermon and his purse. I put it in my pocket. A minute later, I feel in my pocket. There's nothing there." "Except the sermon," said Gavroche. "But you," went on Montparnasse, "where are you bound for now?" Gavroche pointed to his two protégés and said, "I'm going to put these infants to bed." "Whereabouts is the bed?" "At my house." "Where is your house?" "At my house." "So you have a lodging?" "Yes, I have." "And where is your lodging?" "In the Elephant," said Gavroche. Montparnasse, though not naturally inclined to astonishment, could not restrain an exclamation. "In the Elephant?" "Well, yes, in the Elephant," retorted Gavroche. "Qu'est-ce ça?" This is another word of the language which no one writes and which every one speaks. Qu'est-ce ça signifies, "Qu'est-ce que c'est que cela?" What's the matter with that? The urchin's profound remark called Montparnasse to calmness and good sense. He appeared to return to better sentiments with regard to Gavroche's lodging. "Of course," said he. "Yes, the Elephant. Is it comfortable there?" "Very," said Gavroche. "It's really bully there. There ain't any draughts as there are under the bridges." "How do you get in?" "Oh, I get in." "So there is a hole?" demanded Montparnasse. "Parbleu! I should say so." "But you mustn't tell. It's between the forelegs. The bobbies haven't seen it." "And you climb up? Yes, I understand." "A turn of the hand, crick-crack, and it's all over. No one there." After a pause, Gavroche added, "I shall have a ladder for these children." Montparnasse burst out laughing. "Where the devil did you pick up those young 'uns?" Gavroche replied with great simplicity, "They are some brats that a wig maker made me a present of." Meanwhile, Montparnasse had fallen to thinking. "You recognized me very readily," he muttered. He took from his pocket two small objects which were nothing more than two quills wrapped in cotton, and thrust one up each of his nostrils. This gave him a different nose. "That changes you," remarked Gavroche. "You are less homely so. You ought to keep them on all the time." Montparnasse was a handsome fellow, but Gavroche was a tease. "Seriously," demanded Montparnasse, "how do you like me so?" The sound of his voice was different also. In a twinkling, Montparnasse had become unrecognizable. "Oh, do play Polichinelle for us," exclaimed Gavroche. The two children, who had not been listening up to this point, being occupied themselves in thrusting their fingers up their noses, drew near at this time, and stared at Montparnasse with dawning joy and admiration. Unfortunately, Montparnasse was troubled. He laid his hand on Gavroche's shoulder and said to him, emphasizing his words, "Listen to what I tell you, boy. If I were on the square, with my dog, my knife, and my wife, and if you were to squander 10 sous on me, I wouldn't refuse to work. But this isn't Shrove Tuesday." This odd phrase produced a singular effect on the gamin. He wheeled round hastily, darted his little sparkling eyes about him with profound attention, and perceived a police sergeant standing with his back to them a few paces off. Gavroche allowed an "Ah, good!" to escape him, but immediately suppressed it, and shaking Montparnasse's hand, "Well, good evening," said he. "I'm off to my Elephant with my brats. Supposing that you should need me some night, you can come and hunt me up there. I lodge on the entresol, There is no porter. You will inquire for Monsieur Gavroche." "Very good," said Montparnasse. And they parted, Montparnasse betaking himself in the direction of the Grève, and Gavroche towards the Bastille. The little one of 5, dragged along by his brother, who was dragged by Gavroche, turned his head back several times to watch Porrichinelle as he went. The ambiguous phrase, by means of which Montparnasse had warned Gavroche of the presence of the policeman, contained no other talisman than the assonance dig, repeated 5 or 6 times in different forms. This syllable, dig, uttered alone or artistically mingled with the words of a phrase, means, "Take care, we can no longer talk freely." There was, besides, in Montparnasse's sentence, a literary beauty which was lost upon Gavroche. That is, "Mon dog, ma dague, et ma digue," a slang expression of the Temple, which signifies "my dog, my knife, and my wife," greatly in vogue among clowns and the red tails, in the great century when Molière wrote and Callot drew. 20 years ago, there was still to be seen in the southwest corner of the Place de la Bastille, near the basin of the canal, excavated in the ancient ditch of the fortress prison, a singular monument, which has already been effaced from the memories of Parisians, and which deserved to leave some trace, for it was the idea of a member of the Institute, the General-in-Chief of the Army of Egypt. We say monument, although it was only a rough model, but this model itself, a marvellous sketch, the grandiose skeleton of an idea of Napoleon's, which successive gusts of wind have carried away and thrown on each occasion, still further from us, had become historical, and had acquired a certain definiteness, which contrasted with its provisional aspect. It was an elephant 40 feet high, constructed of timber and masonry, bearing on its back a tower which resembled a house, formerly painted green by some dauber, and now painted black by heaven, the wind, and time. In this deserted and unprotected corner of the place, the broad brow of the colossus, his trunk, his tusks, his tower, his enormous crupper, his 4 feet, like columns, produced at night, under the starry heavens, a surprising and terrible form. It was a sort of symbol of popular force. It was sombre, mysterious, and immense. It was some mighty, visible phantom, one knew not what, standing erect beside the invisible spectre of the Bastille. Few strangers visited this edifice, no passer-by looked at it. It was falling into ruins. Every season the plaster which detached itself from its sides formed hideous wounds upon it. The Idylls, as the expression ran in elegant dialect, had forgotten it ever since 1814. There it stood in its corner, melancholy, sick, crumbling, surrounded by a rotten palisade, soiled continually by drunken coachmen. Cracks meandered athwart its belly, a lath projected from its tail. Tall grass flourished between its legs, and, as the level of the place had been rising all around it for a space of 30 years, by that slow and continuous movement which insensibly elevates the soil of large towns, it stood in a hollow, and it looked as though the ground were giving way beneath it. It was unclean, despised, repulsive, and superb. Ugly in the eyes of the bourgeois, melancholy in the eyes of the thinker. There was something about it of the dirt which is on the point of being swept out, and had something of the majesty which is on the point of being decapitated. As we have said, at night, its aspect changed. Night is the real element of everything that is dark. As soon as twilight descended, the old elephant became transfigured. He assumed a tranquil and redoubtable appearance in the formidable serenity of the shadows. Being of the past, he belonged to the night, and obscurity was in keeping with his grandeur. This rough, squat, heavy, hard, austere, almost misshapen, but assuredly majestic monument, stamped with a sort of magnificent and savage gravity, has disappeared, and left to reign in peace a sort of gigantic stove, ornamented with its pipe, which has replaced the sombre fortress with its 9 towers, very much as the bourgeoisie replaces the feudal classes. It is quite natural that a stove should be the symbol of an epoch in which a pot contains power. This epoch will pass away. People have already begun to understand that if there can be a force in a boiler, there can be no force except in the brain. In other words, that which leads and drags on the world is not locomotives, but ideas. Harness locomotives to ideas. That is well done, but do not mistake the horse for the rider. At all events, to return to the Place de la Bastille, the architect of this elephant succeeded in making a grand thing out of plaster. The architect of the stove has succeeded in making a pretty thing out of bronze. This stovepipe, which has been baptized by a sonorous name, and called the Column of July, this monument of a revolution that miscarried, was still enveloped in 1832 in an immense shirt of woodwork, which we regret for our part, and by a vast plank enclosure which completed the task of isolating the elephant. It was towards this corner of the place, dimly lighted by the reflection of a distant street lamp, that the gamin guided his 2 brats. The reader must permit us to interrupt ourselves here, and to remind him that we are dealing with simple reality, and that 20 years ago the tribunals were called upon to judge, under the charge of vagabondage and mutilation of a public monument, a child who had been caught asleep in this very elephant of the Bastille. This fact noted, we proceed. On arriving in the vicinity of the Colossus, Gavroche comprehended the effect which the infinitely great might produce on the infinitely small, and said, "Don't be scared, infants." Then he entered through a gap in the fence into the elephant's enclosure, and helped the young ones to clamber through the breach. The 2 children, somewhat frightened, followed Gavroche without uttering a word, and confided themselves to this little providence in rags, which had given them bread and promised them a shelter. There, extended along the fence, lay a ladder, which by day served the labourers in the neighbouring timber yard. Gavroche raised it with remarkable vigour, and placed it against one of the elephant's forelegs. Near the point where the ladder ended, a sort of black hole in the belly of the Colossus could be distinguished. Gavroche pointed out the ladder and the hole to his guests, and said to them, "Climb up and go in." The 2 little boys exchanged terrified glances. "You're afraid, brats!" exclaimed Gavroche. And he added, "You shall see." He clasped the rough leg of the elephant, and in a twinkling, without deigning to make use of the ladder, he had reached the aperture. He entered it as an adder slips through a crevice and disappeared within, and an instant later the 2 children saw his head, which looked pale, appear vaguely on the edge of the shadowy hole, like a wan and whitish spectre. "Well," he exclaimed, "climb up, young uns. You'll see how snug it is here. Come up, you," he said to the elder. "I'll lend you a hand." The little fellows nudged each other. The gamin frightened and inspired them with confidence at one and the same time. And then it was raining very hard. The elder one undertook the risk. The younger, on seeing his brother climbing up, and himself left alone between the paws of this huge beast, felt greatly inclined to cry, but he did not dare. The elder lad climbed, with uncertain steps, up the rungs of the ladder, Gavroche, in the meanwhile, encouraging him with exclamations like a fencing master to his pupils, or a muleteer to his mules. "Don't be afraid. That's it. Come on, put your feet there. Give us your hand here. Boldly." And when the child was within reach, he seized him suddenly and vigorously by the arm, and pulled him towards him. "Nabbed," said he. The brat had passed through the crack. "Now," said Gavroche, "wait for me. Be so good as to take a seat, monsieur." And making his way out of the hole, as he had entered it, he slipped down the elephant's leg with the agility of a monkey, landed on his feet in the grass, grasped the child of 5 round the body, and planted him fairly in the middle of the ladder. Then he began to climb up behind him, shouting to the elder, "I'm going to boost him. Do you tug." And in another instant, the small lad was pushed, dragged, pulled, thrust, stuffed into the hole, before he had time to recover himself, and Gavroche, entering behind him, and repulsing the ladder with a kick which sent it flat on the grass, began to clap his hands and to cry, "Here we are! Long live General Lafayette!" This explosion over, he added, "Now, young 'uns, you are in my house." Gavroche was at home, in fact. Oh, unforeseen utility of the useless, charity of great things, goodness of giants! This huge monument, which had embodied an idea of the emperor's, had become the box of a street urchin. The brat had been accepted and sheltered by the colossus. The bourgeois, decked out in their Sunday finery, who passed the elephant of the Bastille, were fond of saying, as they scanned it disdainfully with their prominent eyes, "What's the good of that?" It served to save them the cold, the frost, the hail, the rain, to shelter from the winds of winter, to preserve from slumber in the mud which produces fever, and from slumber in the snow which produces death, a little being who had no father, no mother, no bread, no clothes, no refuge. It served to receive the innocent, whom society repulsed. It served to diminish public crime. It was a lair open to one against whom all doors were shut. It seemed as though the miserable old mastodon, invaded by vermin and oblivion, covered with warts, with mould and ulcers, tottering, worm-eaten, abandoned, condemned, a sort of mendicant colossus, asking alms in vain, with a benevolent look in the midst of the crossroads, had taken pity on that other mendicant, the poor pygmy, who roamed without shoes to his feet, without a roof over his head, blowing on his fingers, clad in rags, fed on rejected scraps. That was what the elephant of the Bastille was good for. This idea of Napoleon, disdained by men, had been taken back by God. That which had been merely illustrious had become august. In order to realize his thought, the emperor should have had porphyry, brass, iron, gold, marble. The old collection of planks, beams, and plaster sufficed for God. The emperor had had the dream of a genius, in that titanic elephant, armed, prodigious, with trunk uplifted, bearing its tower and scattering on all sides its merry and vivifying waters. He wished to incarnate the people. God had done a grander thing with it. He had lodged a child there. The hole through which Gavroche had entered was a breach which was hardly visible from the outside, being concealed, as we have stated, beneath the elephant's belly, and so narrow that it was only cats and homeless children who could pass through it. "Let's begin," said Gavroche, "by telling the porter that we are not at home." And plunging into the darkness with the assurance of a person who is well acquainted with his apartments, he took a plank and stopped up the aperture. Again Gavroche plunged into the obscurity. The children heard the crackling of the match thrust into the phosphoric bottle. The chemical match was not yet in existence. At that epoch, the fumade steel represented progress. A sudden light made them blink. Gavroche had just managed to ignite one of those bits of cord dipped in resin which are called cellar rats. The cellar rat, which emitted more smoke than light, rendered the interior of the elephant confusedly visible. Gavroche's two guests glanced about them, and the sensation which they experienced was something like that which one would feel if shut up in the great tun of Heidelberg, or, better still, like what Jonah must have felt in the biblical belly of the whale. An entire and gigantic skeleton appeared enveloping them. Above, a long brown beam, whence started at regular distances massive, arching ribs, represented the vertebral column with its sides. Stalactites of plaster depended from them like entrails, and vast spiders' webs stretching from side to side formed dirty diaphragms. Here and there, in the corners, were visible large blackish spots, which had the appearance of being alive, and which changed places rapidly with an abrupt and frightened movement. Fragments which had fallen from the elephant's back into his belly had filled up the cavity, so that it was possible to walk upon it as on a floor. The smaller child nestled up against his brother and whispered to him, "It's black." This remark drew an exclamation from Gavroche. The petrified air of the two brats rendered some shock necessary. "What's that you're gabbling about there?" he exclaimed. "Are you scoffing at me? Are you turning up your noses? Do you want the Tuileries? Are you brutes? Come, say. I warn you that I don't belong to the regiment of simpletons. Ah, come now, are you brats from the Pope's establishment?" A little roughness is good in cases of fear. It is reassuring. The two children drew close to Gavroche. Gavroche, paternally touched by this confidence, passed from grave to gentle, and addressing the smaller, "Stupid," said he, accenting the insulting word with a caressing intonation. "It's outside that it is black. Outside it's raining. Here it does not rain. Outside it's cold. Here there's not an atom of wind. Outside there are heaps of people. Here there's no one. Outside there ain't even the moon. Here there's my candle, confound it." The two children began to look upon the apartment with less terror, but Gavroche allowed them no more time for contemplation. "Quick," said he, and he pushed them towards what they were very glad to be able to call the end of the room. There stood his bed. Gavroche's bed was complete, that is to say, it had a mattress, a blanket, and an alcove with curtains. The mattress was a straw mat, the blanket a rather large strip of grey woollen stuff, very warm and almost new. This is what the alcove consisted of. 3 rather long poles, thrust into and consolidated with the rubbish which formed the floor, that is to say, the belly of the elephant, 2 in front and 1 behind, and united by a rope at their summits, so as to form a pyramidal bundle. This cluster supported a trellis work of brass wire, which was simply placed upon it, but artistically applied, and held by fastenings of iron wire, so that it enveloped all 3 holes. A row of heavy stones kept this network down to the floor so that nothing could pass under it. This grating was nothing else than a piece of the brass screens with which aviaries are covered in menageries. Gavroche's bed stood as in a cage behind this net. The whole resembled an Esquimaux tent. This trellis work took the place of curtains. Gavroche moved aside the stones which fastened the net down in front, and the 2 folds of the net which lapped over each other fell apart. "Down on all fours, brats," said Gavroche. He made his guests enter the cage with great precaution, then he crawled in after them, pulling the stones together, and closed the opening hermetically again. All 3 had stretched out on the mat. Gavroche still had the cellar rat in his hand. "Now," said he, "go to sleep. I'm going to suppress the candelabra." "Monsieur," the elder of the brothers asked Gavroche, pointing to the netting, "what's that for?" "That," answered Gavroche gravely, "is for the rats. Go to sleep." Nevertheless, he felt obliged to add a few words of instruction for the benefit of these young creatures, and he continued, "It's a thing from the Jardin des Plantes. It's used for fierce animals. There's a whole shop full of them there. All you've got to do is to climb over a wall, crawl through a window, and pass through a door. You can get as much as you want." As he spoke, he wrapped the younger one up bodily in a fold of the blanket, and the little one murmured, "Oh, how good that is! It's warm." Gavroche cast a pleased eye on the blanket. "That's from the Jardin des Plantes too," said he. "I took that from the monkeys." And, pointing out to the eldest the mat on which he was lying, a very thick and admirably made mat, he added, "That belonged to the giraffe." After a pause, he went on, "The beasts had all these things. I took them away from them. It didn't trouble them. I told them, 'It's for the elephant.'" He paused, then resumed, "You crawl over the walls, and you don't care a straw for the government, so there now." The 2 children gazed with timid and stupefied respect on this intrepid and ingenious being, a vagabond like themselves, isolated like themselves, frail like themselves, who had something admirable and all-powerful about him, who seemed supernatural to them, and whose physiognomy was composed of all the grimaces of an old mountebank, mingled with the most ingenious and charming smiles. "Monsieur," ventured the elder timidly, "you are not afraid of the police, then?" Gavroche contented himself with replying, "Brat! Nobody says police, they say bobbies." The smaller had his eyes wide open, but he said nothing. As he was on the edge of the mat, the elder being in the middle, Gavroche tucked the blanket round him as a mother might have done, and heightened the mat under his head with old rags, in such a way as to form a pillow for the child. Then he turned to the elder. "Hey, we're jolly comfortable here, ain't we?" "Ah, yes," replied the elder, gazing at Gavroche with the expression of a saved angel. The two poor little children who had been soaked through began to grow warm once more. "Ah, by the way," continued Gavroche, "what were you bawling about?" And pointing up the little one to his brother, "A mite like that, I've nothing to say about, but the idea of a big fellow like you crying, it's idiotic, you looked like a calf." "Gracious," replied the child, "we have no lodging." "Bother," retorted Gavroche, "you don't say lodgings, you say crib." "And then we were afraid of being alone like that at night." "You don't say night, you say darkmans." "Thank you, sir," said the child. "Listen," went on Gavroche, "you must never bawl again over anything. I'll take care of you. You shall see what fun we'll have. In summer, we'll go to the glacière with Navet, one of my pals. We'll bathe in the Gare. We'll run stark naked in front of the rafts on the bridge at Austerlitz. That makes the laundresses raging. They scream, they get mad, and if you only knew how ridiculous they are. We'll go and see the man-skeleton. And then I'll take you to the play. I'll take you to see Frédéric Lemaître. I have tickets, I know some of the actors. I even played in a piece once. There were a lot of us fellas, and we ran under a cloth, and that made the sea. I'll get you an engagement at my theatre. We'll go to see the savages. They ain't real, those savages ain't. They wear pink tights that go all in wrinkles, and you can see where their elbows have been darned with white. Then we'll go to the opera. We'll get in with the hired applauders. The opera clerk is well managed. I wouldn't associate with the clerk on the boulevard. At the opera, just fancy, some of them pay 20 sous, but they're ninnies. They're called dish-clouts. And then we'll go to see the guillotine work. I'll show you the executioner. He lives in the Rue des Marais, Monsieur Sanson. He has a letter-box at his door. Ah, we'll have famous fun." At that moment, a drop of wax fell on Gavroche's finger and recalled him to the realities of life. "The deuce!" said he. "There's the wit giving out. Attention! I can't spend more than a sou a month on my lighting. When a body goes to bed, he must sleep. We haven't the time to read Monsieur Paul de Kock's romances. And besides, the light might pass through the cracks of the porte cochère, and all the bobbies need to do is to see it." "And then," remarked the elder timidly, he alone dared to talk to Gavroche and reply to him, "a spark might fall in the straw, and we must look out and not burn the house down." "People don't say burn the house down," remarked Gavroche, "they say blaze the crib." The storm increased in violence, and the heavy downpour beat upon the back of the colossus amid claps of thunder. "You're taken in, rain," said Gavroche. "It amuses me to hear the decanter run down the legs of the house. Winter is a stupid. It wastes its merchandise. It loses its labour. It can't wet us, and that makes it kick up a row. Old water carrier that it is." This allusion to the thunder, all the consequences of which Gavroche, in his character of a philosopher of the 19th century, accepted, was followed by a broad flash of lightning, so dazzling that a hint of it entered the belly of the elephant through the crack. Almost at the same instant, the thunder rumbled with great fury. The two little creatures uttered a shriek, and started up so eagerly that the network came near being displaced. but Gavroche turned his bold face to them and took advantage of the clap of thunder to burst into a laugh. "Calm down, children. Don't topple over the edifice. That's fine, first-class thunder, all right. That's no slouch of a streak of lightning. Bravo for the good God. Deuce take it. It's almost as good as it is at the Ambigu." That said, he restored order in the netting, pushed the two children gently down on the bed, pressed their knees in order to stretch them out at full length, and exclaimed, "Since the good God is lighting his candle, I can blow out mine. Now, babes, now, my young humans, you must shut your peepers. It's very bad not to sleep. It'll make you swallow the strainer, or as they say, in fashionable society, stink in the gullet. Wrap yourself up well in the hide. I'm going to put out the light. Are you ready?" "Yes," murmured the elder, "I'm all right. I seem to have feathers under my head." "People don't say head," cried Gavroche. "They say nut." The two children nestled close to each other. Gavroche finished arranging them on the mat, drew the blanket up to their very ears, and repeated, for the third time, his injunction in the heretical tongue, "Shut your peepers!" and he snuffed out his tiny light. Hardly had the light been extinguished when a peculiar trembling began to affect the netting under which the three children lay. It consisted of a multitude of dull scratches which produced a metallic sound, as if claws and teeth were gnawing at the copper wire. This was accompanied by all sorts of little piercing cries. The little 5-year-old boy, on hearing this hubbub overhead, and chilled with terror, jogged his brother's elbow, but the elder brother had already shut his peepers, as Gavroche had ordered. Then the little one, who could no longer control his terror, questioned Gavroche, but in a very low tone and with bated breath. "Sir?" "Hey?" said Gavroche, who had just closed his eyes. "What is that?" "It's the rats," replied Gavroche, and he laid his head down on the mat again. The rats, in fact, who swarmed by thousands in the carcass of the elephant, and who were the living black spots which we have already mentioned, had been held in awe by the flame of the candle so long as it had been lighted, but as soon as the cavern, which was the same as their city, had returned to darkness, scenting what the good storyteller Perrault calls fresh meat, they had hurled themselves in throngs on Gavroche's tent, and had climbed to the top of it and had begun to bite the meshes as though seeking to pierce this new-fangled trap. Still the little one could not sleep. "Sir?" he began again. "Hey?" said Gavroche. "What are rats?" "They are mice." This explanation reassured the child a little. He had seen white mice in the course of his life, and he was not afraid of them. Nevertheless, he lifted up his voice once more. "Sir?" "Hey?" said Gavroche again. "Why don't you have a cat?" "I did have one," replied Gavroche. "I brought one here, but they ate her." This second explanation undid the work of the first, and the little fellow began to tremble again. The dialogue between him and Gavroche began again for the fourth time. "Monsieur?" "Hey?" "Who was it that was eaten?" "The cat." "And who ate the cat?" "The rats." "The mice?" "Yes, the rats." The child, in consternation, dismayed at the thought of mice which ate cats, pursued, "Sir, would those mice eat us?" "Wouldn't they just!" ejaculated Gavroche. The child's terror had reached its climax, but Gavroche added, "Don't be afraid, they can't get in, and besides, I am here. Here, catch hold of my hand. Hold your tongue and shut your peepers." At the same time, Gavroche grasped the little fellow's hand across his brother. The child pressed the hand close to him and felt reassured. Courage and strength have these mysterious ways of communicating themselves. Silence reigned round them once more. The sound of their voices had frightened off the rats. At the expiration of a few minutes, they came raging back, but in vain. The three little fellows were fast asleep and heard nothing more. The hours of the night fled away. Darkness covered the vast Place de la Bastille. A wintry gale, which mingled with the rain, blew in gusts. The patrol searched all the doorways, alleyways, enclosures, and obscure nooks, and in their search for nocturnal vagabonds, they passed in silence before the elephant. The monster, erect, motionless, staring open-eyed into the shadows, had the appearance of dreaming happily over his good deed, and sheltered from heaven and from men the 3 poor sleeping children. In order to understand what is about to follow, the reader must remember that, at that epoch, the Bastille guard-house was situated at the other end of the square, and that what took place in the vicinity of the elephant could neither be seen nor heard by the sentinel. Towards the end of that hour which immediately precedes the dawn, a man turned from the Rue Saint-Antoine at a run, made the circuit of the enclosure of the Column of July, and glided between the palings until he was underneath the belly of the elephant. If any light had illuminated that man, it might have been divined from the thorough manner in which he was soaked that he had passed the night in the rain. Arrived beneath the elephant, he uttered a peculiar cry, which did not belong to any human tongue, and which a paroquet alone could have imitated. Twice he repeated this cry, of whose orthography the following barely conveys an idea. Kirikikyo! At the second cry, a clear, young, merry voice responded from the belly of the elephant. Yes! Almost immediately, the plank which closed the hole was drawn aside, and gave passage to a child, who descended the elephant's leg and fell briskly near the man. It was Gavroche. The man was Montparnasse. As for his cry of Kirikikyo, that was, doubtless, what the child had meant when he had said, "You will ask for Monsieur Gavroche." On hearing it, he had waked with a start, had crawled out of his alcove, pushing apart the netting a little, and carefully drawing it together again. Then he had opened the trap and descended. The man and the child recognized each other silently amid the gloom. Montparnasse confined himself to the remark, "We need you. Come, lend us a hand." The lad asked for no further enlightenment. "I'm with you," said he. And both took their way towards the Rue Saint-Antoine, whence Montparnasse had emerged, winding rapidly through the long file of market gardeners' carts which descend towards the markets at that hour. The market gardeners, crouching, half asleep, in their wagons, amid the salads and vegetables, enveloped to their very eyes in their mufflers on account of the beating rain, did not even glance at these strange pedestrians. End of Book 6, Chapter 2.
Chapter 3 of Book 6 of Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hopgood. Book 6, Little Gavroche. Chapter 3, The Vicissitudes of Flight. This is what had taken place that same night at La Force. An escape had been planned between Babet, Brujon, Guelemer, and Thénardier, although Thénardier was in close confinement. Babet had arranged the matter for his own benefit on the same day, as the reader has seen from Montparnasse's account to Gavroche. Montparnasse was to help them from the outside. Brujon, after having passed a month in the punishment cell, had had time, in the first place, to weave a rope, in the second, to mature a plan. In former times, those severe places where the discipline of the prison delivers the convict to his own hands were composed of 4 stone walls, a stone ceiling, a flagged pavement, a camp bed, a grated window, and a door lined with iron, and were called dungeons. But the dungeon was judged to be too terrible. Nowadays they are composed of an iron door, a grated window, a camp bed, a flagged pavement, 4 stone walls, and a stone ceiling, and are called chambers of punishment. A little light penetrates towards midday. The inconvenient point about these chambers, which, as the reader sees, are not dungeons, is that they allow the persons who should be at work to think. So Valjean meditated, and he emerged from the chamber of punishment with a rope. As he had the name of being very dangerous in the Charlemagne courtyard, he was placed in the new building. The first thing he found in the new building was Gueulemer. The second was a nail. Gueulemer, that is to say, crime. A nail, that is to say, liberty. Valjean, of whom it is high time that the reader should have a complete idea, was, with an appearance of delicate health and a profoundly premeditated languor, a polished, intelligent sprig, and a thief, who had a caressing glance and an atrocious smile. His glance resulted from his will, and his smile from his nature. His first studies in his art had been directed to roofs. He had made great progress in the industry of men who tear off lead, who plunder the roofs, and despoil the gutters by the process called double pickings. The circumstance which put the finishing touch on the moment peculiarly favorable for an attempt at escape was when the roofers were relaying and rejointing, at that very moment, a portion of the slates on the prison. The St. Bernard courtyard was no longer absolutely isolated from the Charlemagne and the St. Louis courtyard. Up above there were scaffoldings and ladders, in other words, bridges and stairs in the direction of liberty. The new building, which was the most cracked and decrepit thing to be seen anywhere in the world, was the weak point in the prison. The walls were eaten by saltpeter to such an extent that the authorities had been obliged to line the vaults of the dormitories with a sheathing of wood, because stones were in the habit of becoming detached and falling on the prisoners in their beds. In spite of this antiquity, the authorities committed the error of confining in the new building the most troublesome prisoners, of placing there the hard cases, as they say in prison parlance. The new building contained 4 dormitories, one above the other, and a top story which was called the bel air or fine air. A large chimney flue, probably from some ancient kitchen of the Duc de la Force, started from the ground floor, traversed all 4 stories, cut the dormitories, where it figured as a flattened pillar, into 2 portions, and finally pierced the roof. Gueulemer and Valjean were in the same dormitory. They had been placed, by way of precaution, on the lower story. Chance ordained that the heads of their beds should rest against the chimney. Thénardier was directly over their heads, in the top story known as bel air. The pedestrian, who halts on the Rue Culture Sainte-Catherine, after passing the barracks of the firemen, in front of the porte cochere of the bathing establishment, beholds a yard full of flowers and shrubs in wooden boxes, at the extremity of which spreads out a little white rotunda with 2 wings, brightened up with green shutters, the bucolic dream of Jean-Jacques. Not more than 10 years ago, there rose above the rotunda an enormous, black, hideous bare wall by which it was backed up. This was the outer wall of La Force. This wall, beside that rotunda, was Milton viewed for Berquin. Lofty as it was, this wall was overtopped by a still blacker roof, which could be seen beyond. This was the roof of the new building. There one could descry 4 dormer windows guarded with bars. They were the windows of the bel air. A chimney pierced the roof. This was the chimney which traversed the dormitories. The bel air, that top story of the new building, was a sort of a large hall, with a mansard roof, guarded with triple gratings and double doors of sheet iron, which were studded with enormous bolts. When one entered from the north end, one had on one's left the 4 dormer windows, on one's right, facing the windows at regular intervals, 4 square, tolerably vast cages, separated by narrow passages, built of masonry, to about the height of the elbow, and the rest, up to the roof, of iron bars. Thénardier had been in solitary confinement in one of these cages since the night of the 3rd of February. No one was ever able to discover how and by what connivance he succeeded in procuring and secreting a bottle of wine, invested, so it is said by Deroux, with which a narcotic is mixed, and which the band of the endormeurs, or sleep compellers, rendered famous. There are, in many prisons, treacherous employees, half jailers, half thieves, who assist in escapes, who sell to the police an unfaithful service, and who turn a penny whenever they can. On that same night, then, when little Gavroche picked up the two lost children, Brujon and Guelemer, who knew that Babet, who had escaped that morning, was waiting for them in the street as well as Montparnasse, rose softly, and with the nail which Brujon had found, began to pierce the chimney against which their bed stood. The rubbish fell on Brujon's bed so that they were not heard. Showers, mingled with thunder, shook the doors on their hinges, and created in the prison a terrible and opportune uproar. Those of the prisoners who woke pretended to fall asleep again, and left Guelemer and Brujon to their own devices. Brujon was adroit, Guelemer was vigorous. Before any sound had reached the watcher, who was sleeping in the grated cell which opened into the dormitory, the wall had been pierced, the chimney scaled, the iron grating, which bared the upper orifice and the flue, forced, and the two redoubtable ruffians were on the roof. The wind and rain redoubled. The roof was slippery. "What a good night to leg it," said Brujon. An abyss 6 feet broad and 8 feet deep separated them from the surrounding wall. At the bottom of this abyss they could see the musket of a sentinel gleaming through the gloom. They fastened on one end of the rope which Brujon had spread in his dungeon to the stumps of the iron bars which they had just wrenched off, flung the other over the outer wall, crossed the abyss at one bound, clung to the coping of the wall, got astride of it, let themselves slip one after the other along the rope upon a little roof which touches the bath-house, pulled their rope after them, jumped down into the courtyard of the bath-house, traversed it, pushed open the porter's wicket, beside which hung his rope, pulled this, opened the porte-cochere, and found themselves in the street. 3/4 of an hour had not elapsed since they had risen in bed, in the dark, nail in hand, and their project in their heads. A few moments later they had joined Babet and Montparnasse, who were prowling about the neighborhood. They had broken their rope in pulling it after them, and a bit of it remained attached to the chimney on the roof. They had sustained no other damage, however, than that of scratching nearly all the skin off their hands. That night Thénardier was warned, without anyone being able to explain how, and was not asleep. Towards 1 o'clock in the morning, the night being very dark, he saw 2 shadows passing along the roof, in the rain and squalls, in front of the dormer window, which was opposite his cage. One halted at the window long enough to dart in a glance. This was Brujon. Thénardier recognized him and understood. This was enough. Thénardier, rated as a burglar, and detained as a measure of precaution under the charge of organizing a nocturnal ambush with armed force, was kept in sight. The sentry, who was relieved every 2 hours, marched up and down in front of his cage with a loaded musket. The Bel Air was lighted by a skylight. The prisoner had on his feet fetters weighing 50 pounds. Every day at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a jailer, escorted by 2 dogs, this was still in vogue at that time, entered his cage, deposited beside his bed a loaf of black bread weighing 2 pounds, a jug of water, a bowl filled with rather thin bouillon, in which swam a few Mayagan beans, inspected his irons, and tapped the bars. This man and his dog made 2 visits during the night. Thénardier had obtained permission to keep a sort of iron bolt which he used to spike his bread into a crack in the wall, in order to preserve it from the rats, as he said. As Thénardier was kept in sight, no objection had been made to this spike. Still, it was remembered afterward that one of the jailers had said, "It would be better to let him have only a wooden spike." At 2 o'clock in the morning the sentinel, who was an old soldier, was relieved and replaced by a conscript. A few moments later the man with the dogs paid his visit, and went off without noticing anything except, possibly, the excessive youth and the rustic air of the raw recruit. 2 hours afterward, at 4 o'clock, when they came to relieve the conscript, he was found asleep on the floor, lying like a log near Thénardier's cage. As for Thénardier, he was no longer there. There was a hole in the ceiling of his cage, and, above it, another hole in the roof. One of the planks of his bed had been wrenched off, and probably carried away with him, as it was not found. They also seized in his cell a half-empty bottle which contained the remains of the stupefying wine with which the soldier had been drugged. The soldier's bayonet had disappeared. At the moment when this discovery was made, it was assumed that Thénardier was out of reach. The truth is that he was no longer in the new building, but that he was still in great danger. Thénardier, on reaching the roof of the new building, had found the remains of Brujon's rope hanging to the bars of the upper trap of the chimney. But, as this broken fragment was much too short, he had not been able to escape by the outer wall as Brujon and Guelemer had done. When one turns from the Rue de Bellay into the Rue de Roi Cecile, one almost immediately encounters a repulsive ruin. There stood on that spot in the last century a house of which only the back wall now remains, a regular wall of masonry, which rises to the height of the third story between the adjoining buildings. This ruin can be recognized by two large square windows which are still to be seen there. The middle one, that nearest the right gable, is barred with a worm-eaten beam, adjusted like a prop. Through these windows there was formerly visible a lofty and lugubrious wall, which was a fragment of the outer wall of La Force. The empty space on the street left by the demolished house is half filled by a fence of rotten boards, shored up by 5 stone posts. In this recess lies concealed a little shanty which leans against the portion of the ruin which has remained standing. The fence has a gate, which a few years ago was fastened only by a latch. It was the crest of this ruin that Thénardier had succeeded in reaching a little after 1 o'clock in the morning. How had he got there? That is what no one has ever been able to explain or understand. The lightning must at the same time have hindered and helped him. He had made use of the ladders and scaffoldings of the slaters to get from roof to roof, from enclosure to enclosure, from compartment to compartment, to the buildings of the Charlemagne Court, then to the buildings of the St. Louis Court, and thence to the hut on the Rue de Roi de Sicily. Had he made use of the ladders and scaffoldings of the slaters to get from roof to roof, from enclosure to enclosure, from compartment to compartment, to the buildings of the Charlemagne Court, then to the buildings of the St. Louis Court, to the outer wall, and thence to the hut on the Rue de Roi de Sicily? But in that itinerary there existed breaks which seemed to render it an impossibility. Had he placed the plank from his bed like a bridge from the roof of the Bel Air to the outer wall, and crawled flat on his belly on the coping of the outer wall to the whole distance round the prison as far as the hut? But the outer wall of La Force formed a crenellated and unequal line. It mounted and descended. It dropped at the firemen's barracks. It rose towards the bathhouse. It was cut in twain by building. It was not even of the same height on the Hôtel La Mignon as on the Rue Pavie. Everywhere occurred falls and right angles, and then the sentinel must have espied the dark form of the fugitive. Hence the route taken by Thénardier still remains rather inexplicable. In 2 manners flight was impossible. Had Thénardier, spurred on by the thirst for liberty which changes precipices into ditches, iron bars into wattles of osier, a legless man into an athlete, a gouty man into a bird, stupidity into instinct, instinct into intelligence, and intelligence into genius. Had Thénardier invented a third mode? No one has ever found out. The marvels of escape cannot always be accounted for. The man who makes his escape, we repeat, is inspired. There is something of the star and of the lightning in the mysterious gleam of flight. The efforts toward deliverance is no less surprising than the flight toward the sublime. And one says of the escaped thief, "How did he contrive to scale that wall?" In the same way that one says of Corneille, "Where did he find the means of dying?" At all events, dripping with perspiration, drenched with rain, with his clothes hanging in ribbons, his hands flayed, his elbows bleeding, his knees torn, Thénardier had reached what children, in their figurative language, call the edge of the wall of the ruin. There he had stretched himself out at full length, and there his strength had failed him. A steep escarpment, 3 stories high, separated him from the pavement of the street. The rope, which he had, was too short. There he waited, pale, exhausted, desperate with all the despair which he had undergone, still hidden by the night, but telling himself that the day was on the point of dawning, alarmed at the idea of hearing the neighboring clock of St. Paul strike 4 within a few minutes, an hour when the sentinel was relieved, and when the latter would be found asleep under the pierced roof, staring in horror at a terrible depth, at the light of the street lanterns, the wet black pavement, that pavement longed for, yet frightful, which meant death, and which meant liberty. He asked himself whether his 3 accomplices in flight had succeeded, if they had heard him, and if they would come to his assistance. He listened. With the exception of the patrol, no one had passed through the street since he had been there. Nearly the whole of the descent of the market gardeners from Montreuil, from Charonne, from Vincennes, and from Bercy to the markets was accomplished through the Rue Saint-Antoine. 4 o'clock struck. Thénardier shuddered. A few moments later, that terrified and confused uproar which follows the discovery of an escape broke forth in the prison. The sound of doors opening and shutting, the creaking of gratings on their hinges, a tumult in the guard-house, the hoarse shouts of the turnkeys, the shock of the musket butts on the pavement of the courts reached his ears. Lights ascended and descended past the grated windows of the dormitories. A torch ran along the ridgepole of the top story of the new building. The firemen belonging in the barracks on the right had been summoned. Their helmets, with the torch lighted up in the rain, went and came along the roofs. At the same time, Thénardier perceived in the direction of the Bastille a wan whiteness lighting up the edge of the sky in doleful wise. He was on top of a wall 10 inches wide, stretched out under the heavy rains, with 2 gulfs to the right and the left. Unable to stir, subject to the giddiness of a possible fall, and to the horror of a certain arrest, and his thoughts, like the pendulum of a clock, swung from one of these ideas to the other. Dead if I fall, caught if I stay. In the midst of this anguish he suddenly saw, the street being still dark, a man who was gliding along the walls and coming from the Rue Pavée, halt in the recess above which Thénardier was, as it were, suspended. Here this man was joined by a second, who walked with the same caution, then by a third, then by a fourth. When these men were reunited, one of them lifted the latch of the gate in the fence, and all 4 entered the enclosure in which the shanty stood. They halted directly under Thénardier. These men had evidently chosen this vacant space in order that they might consult without being seen by the passers-by, or by the sentinel who guards the wicket of La Force a few paces distant. It must be added that the rain kept this sentinel blocked in his box. Thénardier, not being able to distinguish their visages, lent an ear to their words with the desperate attention of a wretch who feels himself lost. Thénardier saw something resembling a gleam of hope flash before his eyes. These men conversed in slang. The first said in a low but distinct voice, "Let's cut. What are we up to here?" The second replied, "It's raining hard enough to put out the very devil's fire, and the bobbies will be along instanter. There's a soldier on guard yonder. We shall get nabbed here." These 2 words, I see go and I see Calais, both of which mean I see, and which belong, the first to the slang of the barriers, the second to the slang of the temple, were flashes of light for Thénardier. By the icico he recognized Brujon, who was a prowler of the barriers. By the icicale he knew Babet, who was, among his other trades, had been an old clothes broker at the temple. The antique slang of the great century is no longer spoken except in the temple, and Babet was really the only person who spoke it in all its purity. Had it not been for the icy Calais, then Thénardier would not have recognized him, for he had entirely changed his voice. In the meanwhile, the third man had intervened. "There's no hurry yet. Let's wait a bit. How do we know that he doesn't stand in need of us?" By this, which was nothing but French, Thénardier recognized Montparnasse, who made it a point in his elegance to understand all slangs, and to speak none of them. As for the fourth, he held his peace, but his huge shoulders betrayed him. Thénardier did not hesitate. It was Guelemer. Brujon replied almost impetuously, but still in a low tone. "What are you jabbering about? The tavern-keeper hasn't managed to cut his stick. He don't tumble into the racket, that he don't. You have to be a pretty knowing cove to tear up your shirt, cut up your sheet to make a rope, punch holes in doors, get up false papers, make false keys, file your irons, hang out your cord, hide yourself and disguise yourself. The old fellow hasn't managed to play it. He doesn't understand how to work the business." Babet added, still in that classical slang, which was spoken by Polière and Cartouche, and which is to the bold, new, highly colored, and risky argot used by Brujon, what the language of Racine is to the language of André Chenier. "Your tavern-keeper must have been nabbed in the act. You have to be knowing. He's only a greenhorn. He must have let himself be taken in by a bobby, perhaps even by a sheep who played it on him, as his pal. Listen, Montparnasse, do you hear those shouts in the prison? You have seen all those lights. He's recaptured there. He'll get off with 20 years. I ain't afraid, I ain't a coward, but there ain't anything more to do, or otherwise they'd lead us a dance. Don't get mad, come with us, let's go drink a bottle of old wine together." "One doesn't desert one's friends in a scrape," grumbled Montparnasse. "I tell you he's nabbed," retorted Brujon. "At the present moment, the innkeeper ain't worth a halfpenny. We can't do nothing for him. Every minute I think a bobby has got me in his fist."
Montparnasse no longer offered more than a feeble resistance. The fact is that these four men, with the fidelity of ruffians who never abandon each other, had prowled all night long about La Force, great as was their peril, and the hope of seeing Thénardier make his appearance on the top of some wall.
But the night, which was really growing too fine, for the downpour was such as to render all the streets deserted, the cold, which was overpowering them, soaked their garments, their hole-ridden shoes, the alarming noise which had just burst forth from the prison, the hours which had elapsed, the patrol which they had encountered, the hope which was vanishing, all urged them to beat a retreat. Montparnasse himself, who was, perhaps, almost Thénardier's son-in-law, yielded. A moment more, and they would be gone. Thénardier was panting on his wall like the shipwrecked sufferers of the Méduse on their raft, when they beheld the vessel which had appeared in sight vanish on the horizon. He dared not call to them. A cry might be heard and ruin everything. An idea occurred to him. A last idea. A flash of inspiration. He drew from his pocket the end of Brujon's rope, which he had detached from the chimney of the new building, and flung it into the space enclosed by the fence. The rope fell at their feet. "A widow," said Babet. "My Tortue," said Brujon. "The tavern-keeper is there," said Montparnasse. They raised their eyes. Thénardier thrust out his head a very little. "Quick," said Montparnasse. "Have you the other end of the rope, Brujon?" "Yes." "Knot the two pieces together. We'll fling him the rope. He can fasten it to the wall, and he'll have enough of it to get down with." Thénardier ran the risk and spoke. "I am paralyzed with cold." "We will warm you up." "I can't budge." "Let yourself slide. We'll catch you." "My hands are benumbed." "Only fasten the rope to the wall." "I can't." "Then one of us must climb up," said Montparnasse. 3 stories!" ejaculated Brujon. The ancient plaster flue which had served for a stove that had been used in the shanty in former times ran along the wall and mounted almost to the very spot where they could see Thénardier. This flue, then much damaged and full of cracks, has since fallen, but the marks of it are still visible. It was very narrow. "One might get up by the help of that," said Montparnasse. "By that flue?" exclaimed Babet. "A grown-up cove? Never. It would take a brat." "A brat must be got," resumed Brujon. Where are we to find a young un? Said Guelemer. Wait, said Montparnasse. I've got the very article. He opened the gate of the fence very softly, made sure that no one was passing along the street, stepped out cautiously, shut the gate behind him, and set off at a run in the direction of the Bastille. 7 or 8 minutes elapsed. 8,000 centuries to Thénardier. Babet, Brujon, and Guelemer did not open their lips. At last the gate opened once more, and Montparnasse appeared, breathless, and followed by Gavroche. The rain still rendered the street completely deserted. Little Gavroche entered the enclosure and gazed at the forms of these ruffians with a tranquil air. The water was dripping from his hair. Guelemer addressed him. "Are you a man, young un?" Gavroche shrugged his shoulders and replied, "A young un like me's a man, and men like you are babes." "The brat's tongue is well hung," exclaimed Babet. "The Paris brat ain't made of mere straw," added Brujon. "What do you want?" asked Gavroche. Montparnasse answered, "Climb up that flue." "With this rope," said Babet. "And fasten it," continued Brujon. "To the top of the wall," went on Babet. "To the crossbar of the window," added Brujon. "And then?" said Gavroche. "There," said Guelemer. The gamin examined the rope, the flue, the wall, the windows, and made that indescribable and disdainful noise with his lips which signifies, "Is that all?" "There's a man up there whom you are to save," resumed Montparnasse. "Will you?" began Brujon again. "Greenhorn," replied the lad, as though the question appeared a most unprecedented one to him, and he took off his shoes. Guelemer seized Gavroche by one arm and set him on the roof of the shanty, whose worm-eaten planks bent beneath the urchin's weight, and handed him the rope which Brujon had knotted together during Montparnasse's absence. The gamin directed his steps toward the flue, which it was easy to enter, thanks to the large crack which touched the roof. At the moment when he was on the point of ascending, Thénardier, who saw life and safety approaching, bent over the edge of the wall. The first light of dawn struck white upon his brow, dripping with sweat upon his livid cheekbones, his sharp and savage nose, his bristling grey beard, and Gavroche recognized him. "Hullo, it's my father! Oh, that won't hinder." And taking the rope in his teeth, he resolutely began the ascent. He reached the summit of the hut, bestrode the old wall as though it had been a horse, and knotted the rope firmly to the upper crossbar of the window. A moment later Thénardier was in the street. As soon as he touched the pavement, as soon as he found himself out of danger, he was no longer either weary or chilled or trembling. The terrible things from which he had escaped vanished like smoke. All that strange and ferocious mind awoke once more, and stood erect and free, ready to march onward. These were the man's first words. "Now, whom are we to eat?" It is useless to explain the sense of this frightfully transparent remark, which signifies both to kill, to assassinate, and to plunder. To eat, true sense, to devour. "Let's get well into a corner," said Brujon. "Let's settle it in 3 words and part at once. There was an affair that promised well in the Rue Plumet, a deserted street, an isolated house, an old rotten gate on a garden, and lone woman." "Well, why not?" demanded Thénardier. "Your girl, Éponine, went to see about the matter," replied Babet. "And she brought a biscuit to Magnon," added Guelemer. "Nothing to be made there." "The girl's no fool," said Thénardier. "Still, it must be seen to." "Yes, yes," said Brujon. "It must be looked up." In the meanwhile, none of the men seemed to see Gavroche, who during this colloquy had seated himself on one of the fence posts. He waited a few moments, thinking that perhaps his father would turn towards him. Then he put on his shoes again and said, "Is that all? You don't want me any more, my men? Now you're out of your scrape. I'm off. I must go and get my brats out of bed." And off he went. The 5 men emerged one after another from the enclosure. When Gavroche had disappeared at the corner of the Rue de Bellay, Babet took Thénardier aside. "Did you take a good look at that young un?" he asked. "What young un?" "The one who climbed the wall and carried you the rope." "Not particularly." "Well, I don't know, but it strikes me that it was your son." "Bah!" said Thénardier. "Do you think so?" End of Book 6, Chapter 3.